And this will be fine because we want you to come back. We don't want this to be a one and done situation.
I can be a regular?
Yeah, well, I mean, if it goes well, if we never reach out to you again, you can judge it based on that.
That's fair.
But if we're like, Ken, get your butt onto a Zoom ASAP, then that's means you did a great job.
All right.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of DC, and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and you're listening to Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics. It was basically the first day of school at the Capitol this past week as state lawmakers, lobbyists, and staff returned to Albany for the opening day of session in both houses. In light of these activities, which included remarks from the legislative leaders and the unveiling of committee chairs for 2025, we wanted to turn our attention to the legislature and really the assembly specifically because we're joined by former assembly member Ken Zebrowski, a Rockland County Democrat who's now with the government affairs firm Brown and Weinraub. How are you feeling about discussing your former institution and colleagues? Anxious, ready, easy, walk in the park?
All of the above. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff, but I'm not there anymore, so I want to be sensitive to my colleagues that they are there in the positions, and I'm not from the outside telling them all what to do.
Well, how are you adjusting to life on the outside, though? Is it like when someone serves, say, a long prison sentence, in your case, 17 years, and they now can't adjust to civilian life? Or is this a nice transition for you?
It's been a nice transition. I loved my time up there and I love the ecosystem and hence what I'm doing now. I didn't go too far. Folks say to me, almost everybody says to me when I see them here for the first time in a while, they say like, "Oh, so how is it not traveling up to Albany?" But the fact of the matter is, I drive up and back at least 3 days a week, and that sort of shocks them. But I think I felt the biggest pangs in my heart in December when they were going up for their retreat. I loved going up for the retreat and just that excitement of starting a new year. But the other day, I don't know, I'd already kind of gotten over it, was running around, had a bunch of stuff. So I'm comfortable with the decision and where I'm at.
Well, let's turn to the actual activities at the Capitol. And this week we got the list of committee chairs for both houses. And for listeners who follow me on social media, you know that I was heavily invested in trying to determine what vacancy would be filled by who. And it was a tough nut to crack, though ultimately I got more guesses right than I got wrong. The big surprise to me was over on the Senate side, where Jamal Bailey moved off codes to take over insurance. On the assembly side, were there any surprises to you or maybe notable changes?
I don't know that I was particularly surprised anything. There's certainly a lot of notable changes, but I think in my mind, a lot of them make sense. My former committee, corporations, went to Ed Braunstein. Ed has always been a strong advocate for like outer borough access and those type of things. He represents Queens. So that I thought was something that made a lot of sense. Just rolling through my head. I mean, Gary Pretlow, very senior, Ways and Means. We've known that for a little bit. CPA. Joanne Simon, mental health, right? Joanne has always dug in on some of those issues. Billy Jones, my good friend from the North Country, local government, right? He represents a ton of local governments, gets involved in those issues. So I think it made sense from I think the triangulation of seniority, skill set, interest, etc.
Well, it seems like it is a triangulation the way you just described it, because I know that Assemblymember Phil Steck, a Capital Region Democrat, wanted mental health and has more seniority than Joanne Simon, but he's not the chair. So it clearly is a balance that the speaker's walking there.
Right. I'm not going to get into the speaker's head. I'll just tell you how I always kind of thought about it. I thought of it as like seniority was like almost in bands with committeeships. You weren't going to jump into another band, but just that exact date and time wasn't always going to be the only factor. skill set, district, area represent? Does the committee, is it particularly tied to something? Are you an educator? Do you make sense for the education committee, a lawyer and judiciary? Take corporations, right? I can't remember the last person that hasn't been in the MTA region. That's a major part of
Yeah.
corporations. So I think all those things go into the decision-making process.
Well, you don't have to weigh in on this beyond what you already said, but Assemblymember Gary Pretlow may be a CPA, but I am really interested to see how he approaches the job of Ways and Means Chair, because this is a role that requires you to be really engaged in order to do the job well. And in the past, at least from my outsider perspective, he does not seem like someone who was actively debating a lot on the floor or focused on a wide range of issues. But thinking about corporations, I always thought of it as a suburb committee. You were a Rockland County Democrat. Should I think of it more as a outer borough and suburb seat in the future? And that's why someone like Ed Braunstein coming from Queens is a natural fit for that?
Well, let me first address Gary. I think Gary's going to dig in. He's going to surprise you. He's going to do a good job.
I sure hope so.
He's a very specific sort of like skill set for a while, chairing racing and wagering. But anyway, when you think back on the corporation's chairs, Jim Brennan was Manhattan, wasn't he? Was he not?
Brennan's from Brooklyn.
Oh, you're right. He's from Brooklyn.
That's the Bobby Carroll seat.
Correct. Bobby's going to be angry at me for that.
Bobby Carroll looks like he could, pass for Manhattanite, though.
Look, the corporation's chair.
Steamroll past that.
I love Bobby. Bobby cracks me up. I still have text messages with Bobby back and forth on some issues. He's a knowledgeable guy. You got to get him on here, and he has some opinions that I think can garner some podcast discussions. But the issue with corporations that I think, at least with the MTA, is you don't want anybody that will only focus on their one thing they care about, right? And so within the entire region, like I was west of Hudson, so we've had complaints forever, but when I came in, I made a specific effort to understand the subway system and what people were talking about, the free buses that folks were pushing for, the issues in Queens and the outer boroughs. So I don't know. I'd have to go back in history and see if anybody from Manhattan, the majority of the subway service, but I still think someone like that could give attention to, the other parts of the district. You just kind of have to take a step back and say, I'm not just a legislator here. I'm representing the assembly majority, and I have to give everybody some attention.
There's obviously a lot of attention that goes into these committee chairs, and I know lobbyists were very interested in where these things were going to go based on the responses I got to my speculation about it. But do we put too much emphasis on the importance of committee chairs, either in terms of the bills that might move through their committee and the role that they play in deciding what's actually going to greenlight, or their role in overseeing areas for budget negotiations? I mean, how do you go about assessing the significance of these announcements?
I think they're significant. No, I don't think you put too much attention on it. I think a committee chair is given quite a bit of deference to the evaluation of issues and the setting of the agenda. I think by virtue of the position, they end up being the subject matter expert in a lot of ways, and they have so many meetings and get visited by so many members that they understand the four corners of an issue better than most, and sort of help the leadership structure and the speaker make decisions. But that being said, there is a limit to it, right? There is still 150 members, 103, I believe, in the majority, and the speaker. So it's not like the chair can be out of step with the majority of the conference and, completely change where the assembly is going. But I do think it's really important.
Well, I apparently got some people interested in the committee on committees in the assembly when I tweeted about Catalina Cruz taking over that leadership role and suggesting that was a big deal. My understanding is that this is a relatively new committee and it helps members navigate the committee process, although they're not, say, the arbitrator of what might move the way the working rules is on the Senate side. Do you have any experience with the quote unquote committee on committees? And what's your sense of their role in the legislative process?
I don't think it's a new committee, but I do think in the past several years, the committee on committees chair has been attempting to organize better the structure of how the committees are operating. I think the legislature and the speaker are constantly sort of like in this evaluative process of how to take the mass amount of work that needs to get done, best give everybody a voice, but forge consensus. So, how as a member you can put forth an issue, make sure it's being considered by the chair and the staff and the speaker. How you don't let maybe personal squabbles get in the way of evaluating issues. How you make sure everybody feels like a voice. I think the speaker has looked to that committee in the past, and we've had discussions. It was Alicia Heineman for a while, and
Yep.
she really did take a leadership role in attempting, and members were, I think, encouraged if for whatever reason you feel like you weren't getting your issue heard, talk to Alicia. Maybe she could be a liaison with the chair. I don't know. You'd have to ask her how many times that happened. It didn't really happen with me. Maybe because
A savvy
I,
political veteran who just knows how to work the levers of power here in Albany. Humble brag. It's all right.
oh,
We're all thinking it.
I tried to give everybody an ear. So while the committee on committees may sound like an odd name, I do think it was sort of like an organizational structure that the Assembly majority attempted to make more formal and have a real role for it in the last several years that I was there.
Do you think having Catalina Cruz in that position is meaningful to her and her political career? Because this is someone who we widely speculate about as someone who could be taking on additional leadership opportunities in the future, whether that's assembly, whether that's in New York City specifically. I wonder whether this is a chance to build more bridges with colleagues throughout the chamber on the Democratic side of the aisle and potentially, boost her profile internally. Is that something that you think is possible?
Sure, I think Catalina's a rising star. I hesitate even to even say rising because she's taken on a bunch of big issues in her time there. I'm not sure how many terms she's been there, but yeah, obviously. So she's somebody that I think already is looked to in sort of like a rising leadership role, and in the fact that the committee on committees is sort of like seen as this organizational structure type of process, and maybe it can even grow from there. Doing a good internal job as a legislator, I think can boost your profile and your influence within the body. Or I don't know where Catalina wants to go in her career, but it could be helpful there as well.
Well, before we move on, I got to pay the bills, and I want to mention our underwriters for dispatches from Planet Albany, and they are the New York AFL-CIO and New York State United Teachers, and we're saving a spot if Brown and Weinraub ever wants to, cut a check to make this possible. Turning to the assembly,
I'm a big fan, so send me over your price sheet, and I'll bring it to the powers that be.
we will follow up. So. Thinking about the Assembly Speaker's remarks on opening day, Carl Hastie touched on ending income taxes for quote unquote low income families, addressing the unemployment insurance costs on businesses, providing more resources for raise the age implementation, as well as tax deductions for small businesses and farms. And then there was kind of the same old general platitudes that we get every year. Are you expecting this year to look demonstrably different in terms of what the Assembly prioritizes in the budget or standalone legislation, either because of a reaction to the 2024 elections, or what might come out of Washington, D.C., or just the events that pop up, like the killing of an incarcerated New Yorker in central New York, that might prompt action? Or do you think this is kind of, same old based on the makeup of the chamber?
A specific current event can always spark a bill either being drafted or a bill shaking loose that was maybe, not moving or get on the fast track. All of those things, I think, are things that have been talked about over the years on the minds of New Yorkers, right? I mean, when you said that, my mind bounced to, I think James Carville said, was it taxes, education, healthcare? Was that like back in the Clinton administration or something I learned, right? And it was like the old adage of work those three issues in, right? But like, aren't those always issues that are on the minds of folks, whatever the specific thing going on, right? Maybe we're talking about teacher evaluations one year, or the formula with education another year, or maybe, we're talking about affordability and taxes in some ways. But like, those things are all important. And government, I think, is a combination of attempting to meld, people's personal issues, what they're hearing in the districts, what's going on in the country, and what's going on in the states. So, we all, I think, understand that through the economy and inflation, affordability is on people's minds. It's on legislators' minds. So that will be definitely a priority. But it's always a priority. Like, it's not like suddenly in 2025, people are talking about taxes and affordability. I've never talked about it before.
When we think about school funding, one of those recurring issues that always comes up in Albany, how would you rate the chances of the Assembly Democrats embracing a recommendation from the Rockefeller Institute to phase out the so-called hold harmless provision? Would you say it's a 0% chance, or is there a number less than zero that you would like to identify?
Look, if I was a legislator, any proposal that was going to reduce the funding to my schools, I would oppose. That's my job. And so, that's the problem with changing the formula. I used to have this discussion with my school districts all the time, is they would say, we need to update the formula. And I'd say, I don't disagree, but you're assuming you're a winner.
Be careful what you ask for.
And unless we're increasing funding for everybody, that's fine. But then there's going to be winners and losers. It's a tremendously difficult discussion. So, to your question, 0 or less than 0. I don't know. Maybe there's a middle ground somewhere, and maybe there's a way to surgically go in and figure it out. But it's going to be difficult.
Every time I hear the winners and losers line, and we're hearing that a lot now as we begin to talk about the school funding, my mind immediately goes to the lyrics for Atlantic City, which I have now basically memorized. Down here, it's just winners and losers, and don't get caught on the wrong side of that line. Do you feel like there's an opportunity for someone to embark on a Bruce Springsteen rendition from the legislature, or have we passed that sort of Rubicon now that Todd Kaminsky's left the chamber?
Can I ask you a Bruce question before
Sure.
we do that?
Yeah.
I like Bruce. I'm not the biggest Bruce guy, like 10th Avenue Freaked Out and all that stuff. Like, I don't know. I could do without that. The band did a rendition of that song that came on my Apple Music the other day. He wrote it or they wrote it?
I believe it's a Bruce Springsteen song, but hang on while we would do a live fact check.
Because the band I think of as, they were in a similar genre at some point, but I would think of the band as being pre-Bruce Springsteen, but I guess perhaps I'm wrong.
Atlantic City is a song written and recorded by Bruce Springsteen, which appeared on Springsteen's 1982 solo album, Nebraska, which I will add parenthetically is going to be the subject of a movie starring Jeremy Allen White, which I am particularly excited for.
Now, Nebraska is a great album. We'll agree on that. So back to your question about Todd Kaminsky?
Or just in general, any lawmakers that you would think might break out some Bruce Springsteen on the session floor or in karaoke when, prodded with enough drinks?
I would only pick an ex-legislator now to tell you that.
So Diane Savino?
What was your question again? I don't remember your question.
Why don't we move along? Yeah. And I'm curious about the issues that were on the table at the end of the legislative session, and from my perspective, got held up because of how you just sort of run out of time for bills at the end of the session, in part last year because of how the governor threw a congestion pricing grenade into your lap. And specifically, there's the effort to increase the short-term disability insurance benefit, as well as the extended producer responsibility, which deals with single-use plastic packaging. The sponsors of both of those bills say we were primed, ready to go, had the support, we just ran out of time. Does the legislature now in 2025, in the Assembly specifically, just pick those up and say, we were good to go in 2024, let's just pass those? Or do you anticipate on those issues, as well as anything else that maybe was moving along, they're going to start from the beginning again?
I won't start from the beginning again, but I don't think they'll just pick it up and pass those. Those are big, complicated bills. You got new legislators. And so I think there'll be, an evaluation of all those, how the speaker or the majority leader, chooses to forge or find consensus on those is kind of up to them. Will they, reconference them? Are there additional voices? What additional data or things are in there? Certainly, in a lot of these discussions is, we talked about the priority of affordability. So there are different arguments as to whether or not these things would cost money. I don't think there's too many things that are like just ready, but there's just not enough time. That's like a big ticket issue. I think it's like there wasn't maybe enough time to have the final negotiations that were necessary. Not that there just wasn't like debate time.
You don't think so? You don't think that some of these items don't get killed because it's like, hey, there's a calculation that the Assembly Republicans have said they're going to debate this. That means we're going to spend 3 hours. And, I can't commit 3 hours to this when we've got XYZ things that need to be done because those are issues that are really expiring. And I got so many members that need to get out of town because session technically ended a couple days ago.
I think that can happen, but I don't think it happens with the big ticket items that you're thinking about. I think it gets to a point where it's impossible to come to a deal on this because there's not enough time.
Well, lastly, the first big priority that Governor Hochul laid out for 2025 is her rebate check idea, which has a price tag of about $3 billion. And I am skeptical that this will be adopted as exactly like she proposed. I think she's going to get some sort of refund check in the final budget negotiations. When you think about what's been proposed and what the Assembly will prioritize, what sort of changes do you think they'll be looking for in this program? Or do you think they'll be focusing more on what they can get in exchange for going along with the governor's priority?
I mean, giving money back to New Yorkers is never a bad thing, but it does tend to be expensive, right? Now, the thing about it is sometimes it's compared against other programs, but those programs are generally recurring costs. So even things that are less expensive, you got to budget out. And that's how the budget, obviously continues to grow. And then you got to figure out what's happening with revenue in the out years. So,
God, you sound like you could work at DOB with that conservative take to budgeting. Are you sure you were an Assembly majority member?
That's not fair. we have many very responsible and wonky Assembly majority budget members,
including Gary Pretlow.
Absolutely, Gary.
First and foremost,
Gary balances people's taxes, can balance the books of the state. I don't think it'll be like a give and take. Look, I feel like anytime there's been sort of a rebate check idea, it ends up getting there in some way, shape, or form. And I think you sort of suggested that. But there's a lot of other priorities. Affordability is an interesting thing because it means different things to different people. So yeah, giving people a few $100s they'll like and they'll help. And if you have extra money, that probably is something folks think. If you have a budget surplus, well, that means we paid extra taxes, the we being the New Yorkers, and maybe give it back. So there's an argument to be made for that. But there's also big things that folks that are in families' affordability that have never been able to be funded. It's never easy. And you come out of a budget oftentimes with a lot of people a little bit happy, a little bit unhappy, and you kind of come out, exhausted from it because you can't fulfill all those needs.
Well, on that note, we've been speaking with former Assemblymember Ken Zebrowski. He's now with the lobbying firm Brown and Weinraub. Assemblymember, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
This has been great. Will I get the invite back?
Well, that'll depend partially on the feedback we get from the listeners and how long it takes me to edit down this segment, because if it's easy going, then that's a big factor as I think about moving forward who we book.
If I get my friends and family to do 5-star reviews, that helps.
That definitely helps. That's definitely something we take under consideration.
All right, fair enough.
And one last housekeeping note for listeners of our first episode of this season, Chantel Smith is interested in hearing from you with your questions for her. And you can leave a question by calling 518-650-1463 and leaving us a voicemail or writing an email to david.lombardo@wcny.org. If you want to be anonymous, shoot us an email. If you want to be on the air, leave us a voicemail.
How'd I do?
Good.
Fine.
We'll get you to shake, some of your natural tendencies to like reserve the option to one day run for office again. We'll get you lighting things on fire.
There's Ken up and down the thruway who's willing to chat with you. And then there's on air Ken. Maybe we can break down the barriers.